Justin Giboney is an attorney and political strategist in Atlanta, Georgia. He is also the co-founder and president of the AND campaign, which is a coalition of Christians determined to represent a clear and credible Christian witness in politics and culture. Mr. Giboney has managed successful campaigns for elected officials in the state and referendums relating to the city's transportation and water infrastructure. In 2012 and 16, he served as a delegate for the Democratic National Convention and the co-chair of Obama for America's Gen 44 Atlanta. Justin served on the Vanderbilt University Board of Directors and the Urban League of Greater Atlanta Board of Directors. Additionally, he has participated in Lead Atlanta, Outstanding Atlanta, and the Georgia Bar Association's Leadership Academy. He's written op-eds for publications such as Christianity Today and The Hill, and has been asked to speak in a variety of venues, including at Princeton University and at the MLK 50 conference. We invite Justin to share his perspective on the intersection between faith, politics, and the whole life movement.
Good morning. I certainly would like to thank Democrats for Life, Kristen Day, and everyone else for inviting me here today. It's an honor to speak to you. I got here early in the morning, this morning. When I was on the plane, for some reason, my sinuses went haywire, so you'll have to excuse my nasal tone. I'm sure the lady at the desk, my eyes were red, my nose was literally running like a faucet, and I'm sure she wanted to refer me to some type of counseling or something like that, because I was looking pretty bad. But thank you for having me. I think this is an important conversation to have. I know that while many of us are Democrats, we may disagree on some issues. In Christianity, we have the understanding of co-belligerents, which are people who can come together on certain issues even if we disagree on others, that we have a primary objective that we want to reach. I do want to recognize my family, my mother and father, my grandmother, uncle and aunt, who all came to support me today. So I appreciate them being here. And as you heard, I'll be talking about the intersection between faith, politics, and the whole life movement. And I want to start this with a quote that many of you may have heard before. And it says, "I would unite with anybody to do right, and with nobody to do wrong." That is the orator, writer, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Now, a lot of people have heard that quote before, but don't necessarily understand the context of that quote. And that quote comes from a lecture, It comes from a lecture that Frederick Douglass was giving in 1855 in Rochester, New York. And what he was saying was that he would partner with the American Anti-Slavery Society to abolish slavery, because that was such an important issue to him, that he was committed, just as they were, to ridding the country of this evil. And so that was something that they could work on. But at the same time, he was saying that he would not support their effort to abolish the government or the union as a whole. You see, this organization, the American Anti-Slavery Society, their motto was "No union with slaveholders." They believed the Constitution to be a slave-holding instrument. Thus, they had to abolish the country for the sake of emancipation. They kind of had a burn it all to the ground mentality. Now, while Douglass understood the flaws in the Constitution, while he understood the blind spots of the founders, he understood the urgency and imperative of ending this demonic institution. Because he had been a slave himself, none of this was lost on him. He understood the importance of it. But he believed the Constitution opened the door and provided the apparatus to abolish slavery. So in return, his response to what they were saying was that to dissolve the Union as a means to abolish slavery is about as wise as it would be to burn up this city in order to get the thieves out. Basically, he was saying it was counterproductive, that actually the Constitution gave us order and laws to actually use to abolish slavery. Now, while I'm interested in this quote, in talking about this isn't really about slavery. It's not about emancipation. The bigger issue here for this conversation for me is to understand that Frederick Douglass knew that he had to think critically about the strategy and tactics even of his partners, right? And I think that goes over to party as well. That while you may be in the Democratic Party, there are still issues that you're willing to stand up and say, no, this isn't right. That when it comes to life issues, when it comes to human dignity, you have the courage and critical thought to say, hold up, we may be co-belligerents on some things, but on other things, we may part. There may be differences, and I'm going to call you out on that. And the reason that's important is because this room should be filled with a lot more people. But a lot of Democrats have taken the position, because we agree on some major issues, let me be silent on this one issue because it could hurt the party, right? And I think we really have to spread the message that as critical thinkers, as people who really care about the Democratic Party and really care about life, that we have to step up and say something. This is not a zero-sum game. We have to step up and say something to our party, even when there are issues that are very serious that we may agree on. And so I offer that message to the Democratic Party, that I will partner with anybody to do right and nobody to do wrong. And I think our party will be stronger if more people take that position, that we want this to be the best that can be, and it doesn't involve being okay or being silent when it comes to certain issues. Now, I come here, as you heard, from Atlanta, Georgia. Many of you know that Atlanta, Georgia has a legacy of leadership when it comes to civil rights and social justice in general. And I am proud to take part in that and to meet and have many mentors who are part of the civil rights movement. That's something I take very seriously. But I'll also say that it feels good to be in my hometown. I am from Denver, Colorado. I was raised in Aurora. Went to high school just over the reservoir at Cherry Creek High School. And so it is good to be back. I know Colorado, many great memories, things like the MLK March every year. We called it the Parade. It was one of the largest in the nation, I think only second to Atlanta, Georgia. So it is good to be here. My mother, who I already told you is here, worked for RTD, which is the transit system here. And she actually worked to bring the light rail system to Denver. Worked very hard, and we're seeing that it has expanded beyond what we would have initially thought. I remember it was just one line when she was initially working on it. And for 30 years, my father worked for the Denver Water Department. Worked very hard for 30 years. He worked his way up from a meter reader all the way into the office. And so this is very much a story to me about people that the Democrats care about. My parents coached our sports teams, and they took us to church on Sundays. And something else that they did that was very important is that they talked to me about and introduced me to leaders like Mayor Wellington Webb and Colorado State legislator Senator Regis Groff. I heard a lot of stories about him, who my dad interned with, which created an image in my head of what I believed Democrats to be about. I've been a Democrat all my life. And when I heard about these men, there was always an integrity and a seriousness about them when I saw them. And I could see myself in them. Their presence helped me believe that people who looked like me could be leaders. My parents seemed to take so much pride in working with them and being part of their projects. There was a deep feeling of appreciation. There's always a deep feeling of appreciation when good leaders are around who you can say they care about their constituents, who you can say really represent you and represent your interests. And unfortunately, when I looked at the Republican Party, I could not see people who reflected who I was. I could not see people who looked like me that gave me hope to say I too one day can be a leader. And so that's one of the reasons I do appreciate the Democratic Party. And through growing up with two parents who were very much working class, I got an intimate view and understanding of the lives of America's working class, and came to believe that the Democratic Party valued our struggle. But not just our struggle. To me, the Democratic Party stood for civil rights for all. social programs for the poor, workers' rights, cultural diversity, and compassion towards our neighbor in general. We can go on and talk about serving the least of these, caring for the widow and the immigrant, and investing in our children's education and investing in infrastructure. That's what the party meant to me. Those were the fundamental values that drew me to the Democratic Party. Also, the belief that to some extent the government had a role to play in improving people's lives. I remember watching the tape of Congressman Barbara Jordan's keynote speech in the 1976 Democratic National Convention. Now, I was just watching the tape. I wasn't alive yet. But it helped me understand how the interplay between the people, mediating institutions, and the government should work. You may recall that she famously stated that what we have to do is strike a balance between the idea that the government should do everything and the idea, the belief that the government ought to do nothing. These were things that shaped my understanding of how we should do politics, how we should understand the government. But the overarching principle that I think I appreciate about the Democratic Party is the understanding of the importance of human dignity. The understanding that all humans were created in the image of God and that they deserve to be valued under all circumstances. Categorically, that every life mattered no matter what color, no matter what socioeconomic status or disability. This idea aligns with my Christian upbringing and the values that reflected the character of God. Convictions that do not change with the season. Convictions that do not change with the time, do not change based on public opinion. Human dignity always is in existence. And along with these were the understanding of grace, the grace that we all receive as we continue to fall short of what we were intended to be and what we were intended to do. Now, I wish I could say that I was sure that the party still represented this primarily. At a moment when the Republican president is going to new lows almost on an everyday basis, it is not time for the Democratic Party to stray away from those fundamental values. Now, I want to be clear. I still believe the Democratic Party serves those in need better than the Republican Party does. And that's why I'm still a Democrat. I still believe that the party belongs to the people and not to some elites who are seeking to recreate it in their own image, who are seeking to recreate it to serve their own interests. And I also want to say this is an important point before I go a little further. I believe that your everyday pro-choice American is well-intended and thoughtful. I'm not here to render condemnation on anyone, especially not women who find themselves in crisis situations. We must understand that there are cultural norms and narratives that have led many pro-choice Americans to believe that abortion is a compassionate alternative to life in many circumstances. And I also must say, in a moment of confession, in a moment of vulnerability, that I'm not speaking, or I never speak on the issue of abortion from some moral superiority. Justin Giboney has no moral high ground from which to persecute or condemn others on this issue. That's not why I'm here. I'm not standing on some mountain of a lifetime of piety from which I can shame others. That's not why I'm here, not at all. You see, up until recently, I was silent. Maybe in the last 5 years, I was silent on the issue of abortion. I took the I'm personally against abortion, but stance, but I don't, but I won't pursue policy against it, which essentially to me means it either means two things when people say that. I think it's somewhat of a cop-out. It was a cop-out for me. I think it means I'm sincerely against it, but I want to be in office, right? Or I'm not really against it, but I want to be in office, and I need people whose votes of those who are really against it. Either way, I think it would be crazy for someone to say, I'm against policy, I'm against poverty, but I'm not going to pursue any policies to actually do anything about it. Right? We would think that was pretty silly, and I think that goes both ways. But that's not the only way that that reason that I can't speak from some moral high ground. I also willingly participated in the very permissive culture that goes on in many of our college campuses, where kids are encouraged to binge drink and sleep with one another and then worry about the consequences later. The culture where young women are told to take morning after pills like they're Tylenol, like they're part of some Saturday morning hangover cocktail. Know many people who participated in that, and I've heard the tears of regret afterwards. It's a serious issue, and all these cultural issues play into this abortion culture, into this abortion conversation. We can't leave culture out of this, as we heard earlier. So again, I have no moral high ground to speak from. I only have common ground. I only have common experience, and at the end of the day, as a Christian, common grace. And it's often hard for me to relate to the Republican or conservative version of the pro-life movement, which isn't whole life. And we'll talk about why it's important to be whole life. But I do think it's important for us here as Democrats to understand and acknowledge the fact that the pro-life movement has at times failed to demonstrate compassion concerning those in crisis situations. I think we would find many more allies if people didn't relate what we were doing to lacking compassion. Many more people would step up and say, I'm with you, but no one wants to seem like they're forcing someone to do something that they don't want to do. Our point of view has to say more than you better have that child and then beg and then watch it starve and then watch it get placed in this prison pipeline. And I think pro-life Democrats are in the best position to do those things. And we need to take up that task. And I'm glad you all are here doing that. As you heard earlier, in 2012, I ran to be a delegate at the Democratic National Convention in John Lewis's district in Atlanta. And I ran with some elder statesmen in Atlanta. It was the dean of the Atlanta City Council, who was C.T. Martin, the eldest member of the Fulton County Board of Commissioners, who was Emma Darnell. And really, they were running on a slate, and they wanted someone younger to run with them, someone from the next generation. And so I was kind of tagging along. Our slate ended up winning, and we went off to the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte, I believe it was that year. And in that year in Charlotte, when you get to the Democratic National Convention, you hear all the talk of what's going to be on the platform, what people are trying to do. And that was the year that people on the far left wanted to take God-given out of the platform. They didn't want God in there. They didn't want God-given in there. Now, we understand that God-given is really only a nod to natural law. It's basically saying that our rights are God-given. And by saying that, that means that nobody can take them away. It's not specific to a certain religion, but it does make sure that our rights are inalienable. That there's something that our rights are something that human beings can't take from one another, that they're there regardless of if someone likes it or not. And that's obviously reflected in the Constitution. And so I left there. What ended up happening is we did this by a voice vote. You can look it up on the internet. And it was very clear that the people that wanted God-given out of the platform were a lot louder and more excited than the people that wanted it in. And I remember that moment looking around and saying, wow, I have to distinguish myself from this group somehow. And what ended up happening was they knew that would give red meat to the Republicans. And so they didn't take it out. But really, if they were going to be honest, they should have. But they left it in there. So I left disheartened, and I ended up creating a group called Crucifix and Politics. And the group was me and some other younger politicos in Atlanta that I knew. And I really created it so we could figure out a way for Christians to distinguish themselves within the Democratic Party. How do I stay within the party, but let people know that we all don't think the same? And it was kind of a Bible study / support group for people who really wanted to maintain their faith and stay in the party. I also ran to be a delegate in 2016, but this time I said, you know what? I'm actually going to run on my faith. I'm actually going to run on my values in the same district. So me and 3 other people from my Crucifix and Politics group ran on a biblical platform. And when I went up to speak, I actually talked about pro-life issues. I actually talked about the Christian sexual ethic, things of that nature. And we ended up winning probably by double or triple anybody else in the building. This is in John Lewis's district, right? And I appreciate the applause, but the reason that I did it was to prove the point that there are a lot of people who maintain those values in urban spaces, in progressive spaces, but are just not being heard, are just not having a voice within the party. They're being overlooked. And so that was the reason I thought it was important to start that conversation, and the fact that we won caused a big issue. There were groups that wanted me kicked out of the Georgia delegation because I had made statements about pro-life issues. I had made statements and they misrepresented my statements. They didn't know I had taped the whole thing, right? So when it came up and they saw what I actually had said, that it wasn't offensive at all, but it was coming from a place of faith, right? It was coming from a place of someone who believes deeply in certain principles. And I have to be honest, at the 2016 Democratic National Convention, I felt uncomfortable as a person of faith at that convention. Not because there were certain things that I disagreed with. I've been in politics for long enough to know that's just part of what goes on. I'm fine with that. I can understand pluralism within the party. That's to be expected. But because there no longer seemed to be room for people who held more centered views on social issues. If you didn't place individual expression and individual behavior over all else, then either you needed to be converted or you needed to be silenced. It's almost as if you were expected to have a religious adherence to the party's agenda. That the party was supposed to trump your religious beliefs. And that if your religious beliefs conflicted with that agenda, they had to be subordinated. And I left very much with that feeling. Because we had gone from safe, legal, and rare for, I don't know if anybody else was there, to really a celebration of this deadly procedure. A celebration of it as a social good, rather than something that we should be trying to prevent. And I really think that the Democrat donor class and party leadership are way out ahead of your normal Democrat on many different social issues. The policies, unfortunately, seem to come straight from the interest groups to the politicians, to policy, rather than actually going through the people for a level of discourse and public conversation so we can actually think through these things. It's not supposed to go straight from, It is not supposed to go straight from an interest group to legislation. That's not the way it's supposed to happen. But on many issues, over and over again, we see this happening. So let's talk a little bit about the intersection between faith and politics. And again, I am a Christian. I'm a Christian Democrat. And I'm very happy to be a co-belligerent with others who think differently, even in this room. But I want to let you know where my pro-life or pro-whole life stance comes from. The subject of the intersection between faith and politics is what my ministry focuses on. I write articles about it in national publications. I host a podcast on it and created an organization, as you heard, the AND campaign, to address the intersection between faith and politics. It's an issue I believe that Americans will have to get right if they want to see our nation's political system and cultural discourse improve. No nation can thrive if it dismantles its moral anchor. Part of making sure that this is balanced and understanding this intersection is putting things into their proper place. So as someone who's managed campaigns, been in politics for a long time, I understand that politics is important because it impacts every aspect of society. For better or for worse, all your organizations, everyone here, once you walk outside, in some way you're going to be impacted by politics. But at the same time, I understand that it should not be all-consuming. That it shouldn't be placed over one's values, right? Politics in a way, and the party in a way, is a means. It's not an end in and of itself. And I think it's become an open secret that in democratic politics and in urban progressive spaces, that people of faith are expected to keep their values private, keep them at home. You can enjoy the trappings and the language of religion, that's fine, but you better not bring the substance into the public square. The substance needs to stay out of the public square. Otherwise, you're not being fair to others. You're being bigoted and all these other things. And many of us have been taught that we must separate our values from our politics because of the separation of church and state. That's how that's been used. The Establishment Clause of the First Amendment has been used to say that your values should be separate from your politics. The problem with that is that that's not what the Establishment Clause says, and that's not what it's there for. The Establishment Clause prevents the government from creating a state religion. It prevents the government from sanctioning a religion. It was not intended to keep you from using your values to make political decisions or within your advocacy. In fact, there is no other way to make political decisions or to advocate. Listen to this. Your values are basically just principles and standards of behavior. As an attorney and someone who has drafted legislation, I can tell you that laws are based on just that, principles and standards of behavior. You cannot create a law without applying someone's values, right? Every time you vote, every time you advocate or debate, values are being brought to bear, and if they're not your own values, then they're simply someone else's values. So if we fall for the idea that we can't bring our values into the public square, all we're doing is putting our values aside and accepting someone else's values. And especially for the pro-choice movement and others, to get people to subside their values opens up a door that really shouldn't even be opened. Because it gives you the opportunity to now fill this with narratives, now fill it with things that may not be true at all and would be blocked if people's values were actually brought into this space. And so the idea that you can separate your values from your politics really is a political construct, right? For those in the political class who are kind of dependent on the favor and resources of the very far left. And anybody who knows people who are running, who have been around people who are running in democratic politics, knows that it's almost a prerequisite that on abortion and other issues, you got to let it go or you're not going to get any support. You're not going to get exposure. You're not going to get any funding. You have to basically subside those values and leave them where you found them. And in fact, I'll say this. The party is now openly engaging in what we have coined as religious exclusion. And religious exclusion involves the intimidation of people with certain religious beliefs to coerce them into self-censoring or denying those beliefs, or the use of other tactics to limit their political participation. It is marked by a focus on creed rather than policy. The overall goal is to silence people of faith and to exclude them from public office solely because of their religious beliefs. Right? So the idea behind it is that we'll take your votes because without the votes of people of faith, we couldn't win a dog catcher's race. But when it's time for you to run for office, we don't want you in that position because you're unfit because of what you believe. So take your vote, don't want you to represent us. And in Georgia, and this is going on all over the country, it's pretty silent because they are smart enough to isolate people, right? So I'll choose a person here, I'll choose a person there. Hey, what are your values? What do you believe? And if you're not savvy enough to be right in line with the platform on pro-life issues and other issues, then they'll do everything they can to get rid of you. In fact, we had two African-American Christians who ran in Georgia a cycle or two ago. Lee Jenkins ran for the mayor of Roswell. Dr. Jaha Howard ran to be a state senator. And let me tell you, these are two guys as a former campaign manager who are A+ candidates. These are the type of people that you want to run. One's a dentist, One had a financial background, had done a lot in the financial industry, both doing very well, both advocates for education, advocates for the poor. You would think they fit right into what the Democratic Party would want. Unfortunately, when it came to issues of the Christian sexual ethic, when it came to issues of abortion, they disagreed with what the donor class has said is a must within the party. And so what happens? Well, what happens is they go to forums and they get shouted down. There are mass mailers sent out misrepresenting their positions and saying you should not vote for this person for such and such a reason. When it comes to Lee Jenkins, he's a pastor. They actually went to find sermons of his, went through the sermons, and used those sermons just to tear them to shreds. If you look these two guys up on Google, you'll find mostly negative things about them. Not because they didn't care about the community, not because they didn't care about the poor, but because they had values that were not just going to change because the Democratic Party agenda changed. Right? This got so bad that for Jaha Howard, Dr. Jaha Howard, his whole staff left him because they were afraid they wouldn't get another job. He was about to send out a mailer. His mailing company sent him a letter like, we can't send out this mailer. They're not going to allow us to do it. And so if people like us don't speak out and kind of sound the alarm on what's going on, this religious exclusion is going to keep going on. So one of the main things that I wanted to do was to put language behind it. This is religious exclusion. This is how people are being excluded from the space. And the truth of the matter is the Democratic Party can't afford to exclude those people from this space. But they're listening to certain groups and certain donors that think that's the best way to go about it. Now, it's very important to say what kind of Democrats we are and not make it just completely generic, right? To say it's okay to be a different kind of Democrat. We come together for these purposes, but what do you mean when you say you're a Democrat? And so for me, I very much come from the mold of civil rights legend Fannie Lou Hamer. Meaning that my political perspective is informed, if not completely bound, to the traditional black Protestant tradition. Which means my faith cannot be separated from my politics. A colleague of mine, Dr. C.J. Rhodes, who is a scholar and pastor in Jackson, Mississippi, coined the term Hamer Democrats. That we consider ourselves Hamer Democrats because we're very close to what the thoughts of someone like Fannie Lou Hamer. Because for us, the importance of social justice, and it's extremely important, the importance of social justice is coupled with an understanding and appreciation for classic values and a sense of morality, again, that is set and doesn't change with the times. So if I were to call myself a progressive, because we use this word progressive, and it can be a very misleading word to use because it's used so generally, you don't even exactly know what it means. So I used to go have candidates, and I could say this candidate is the most progressive candidate in this race. Everybody goes crazy. Well, what does that even mean? Right? Well, I mean, at the end of the day, what does that mean? And so I think we have to be more specific when we use that. If I'm going to call myself a progressive, I'm really talking about the progressive era. That's my reference point, right? And so I'm focusing more on social programs for the poor, workers' rights, government reform, all these things that give voice to the voiceless. You can throw criminal justice in there. If I'm to say I'm a progressive, that's what I'm talking about. That's not what everyone's talking about. You see, I couldn't call myself a progressive in the very kind of Western European expressive individualism, permissive culture sense of the term. I'm not a progressive in that way, all right? And there's a lot of people in this ideological space that appreciate the Democratic Party's stance on immigration, that appreciate the Democratic Party's stance on health care, but see the party as speeding recklessly away from not only a sense of morality, but also a sense of reason, from a sense of pluralism, and moving so far left on social issues that it's irresponsible, that it's become illiberal, I don't consider myself liberal, but I would love to see more classic liberalism in the Democratic Party instead of shouting down people when they're trying to speak at schools. Instead of trying to stop standing out front of hotels when people are just trying to have a conversation about pro-life issues, right? Just not wanting people who disagree with you to speak, to have a place in the socio-political arena. And the fear is that these progressive era issues that I identify with are being sidelined for the secular progressive issues, which are being championed and funded really by a few elite interest groups. I want to see my party embrace pluralism, which brings us to the whole life movement. I thank God for people like Kristen Day, who have committed their lives to exposing the tragedy of abortion. This is a subject that's really shrouded in false narratives, shrouded in misdirection and hidden agendas. It's not an easy task to take on. Pro-life advocates are branded as not caring about women, not wanting women to control their bodies, not really caring about the children, just wanting to have control over someone else. And all these things are narratives. Sure, there are people who may think that way, but for the most part, those are just false narratives. But without that narrative and people believing that narrative, the pro-choice movement doesn't have much to stand on. Because without the assumption of ill intentions on behalf of pro-lifers, people would actually have to acknowledge the fact that another life is involved in this conversation. See, I tend to believe that in most cases, the world, even when it comes up with the wrong answer, is searching for the right answer, right? And so I think we see people, and we saw women in these crisis situations, and we said, how can we help these crisis situations? And instead of getting rid of the crisis, the answer was to pretend there was no crisis. Pretend there was no other individual or no other life even involved in this. That beating heart's not real. You don't have to worry about that. Just do what you have to do for you, right? Very hard decisions, but the world's answer was to remove one life from the equation and act like there was only one life there. That was the answer. I think that's the wrong answer. I think removing the crisis, as we heard before, is the right answer. But that's kind of what we're dealing with. That's some of the issues that we have to make sure that we're addressing. It's because if we don't, so I want to say this as well. The pro-life movement, mostly from the right, has assisted that narrative at times by separating conception from the dignity of human life throughout life, right? So there's been this separation to say, we just want to focus on conception. We don't want to focus on the whole life conversation. And that has actually helped the narrative that I'm talking about, which forces others to ask, how can one really care about the unborn if you don't seem to care about those who are alive, if they're poor, if they're black or brown, if they're an immigrant? We force people to ask those questions. Protecting the lives of the unborn is important, but that message hasn't always been consistent with the other policies that have been promoted by pro-life people. We must lead on this issue with compassion, which means realizing that this is a tough choice for many women in crisis situations. A 16-year-old who's the victim of incest. A 21-year-old who has no support around her whatsoever. It's not an easy conversation to have, especially if you don't have the foundation and people around you to support you. People who have been abandoned by men and can't see a path forward. To me, the pro-life movement is about human dignity. Straightforward. It's a human dignity conversation, which does start at conception, but certainly doesn't end with birth, and our policies should reflect that we want to be credible in this conversation. And so if we want to be credible, it has to be a whole life conversation. That's why I'm here today. That's why I support Democrats for Life, because this is a whole life conversation, very different from the Republican conservative, have that baby and worry about it yourself later. So in conclusion, in conclusion, I'll say that I have served the Democratic Party for over a decade. And I know there are people here, including Mr. Stupak, who have served for a lot longer than that. My wife and I were knocking on doors in Jacksonville the weekend before the presidential election in 2012, sweating it out, going door to door, making sure people supported the right person for the job. As you heard, I was a co-chair of an organization that raised almost $1 million for the Obama campaign in that same year. And so I've done a lot of service for the Democratic Party. But ultimately, I don't serve the Democratic Party. The party is a vehicle that I use to be about my Father's business. You see, as I hope many of you do, serve higher principles. I am burdened. I have a cross that gives me a higher task that transcends partisanship and transcends politics. I do identify with the party politically, but my identity isn't tied up in the Democratic Party or isn't tied to the Democratic Party. The party platform isn't doctrine to me. Therefore, insofar as the party has turned its back on human dignity, the party will find an opponent in me. And that's why I gave the quote from Frederick Douglass earlier: I will partner with anyone to do good and no one to do evil. We need to go out with the message that it is okay to be a Democrat and question the party on issues of human dignity especially. We can go out and say, no, we care about these women in crisis situations. I'm not here to condemn you. I'm not here to persecute you. I'm not here to make your life harder. In fact, I've been in those situations. I want to help you. But we can only do that if we find allies, even within our party, who can get past these false narratives that have been pushed out so far. The Democratic Party has to be a place where pro-life or whole-life Democrats have a seat at the table. And so I pray that everyone here today will continue the fight. I know it can be discouraging, but I pray that you continue the fight to put the true value of human dignity back into the Democratic Party. Thank you for your time.
Okay, we're going to move right into some questions for these two to try to stay on schedule here. So we have a few minutes of questions. We can only take a few of them.
How can people of faith work together when they might well be the minority in future years?
Yeah, I think through what's called confident pluralism. And I would encourage everybody to read John Anazu's book. He's a law professor, and he wrote a book called Confident Pluralism, which is really about being able to go into the public square and not hide who you are. Appreciate that we have different, be confident in the fact that we have different understandings, different ideas, right? But also be confident in who you are, but also at the same time, understand that there are differences and respect the differences of other people. I personally believe that as a Christian, I shouldn't come to you with a policy that I can't explain in terms of human flourishing that you see benefits you. So I think a lot of Christians in times past came with policies basically saying this is what the Bible says and therefore you should follow it. I think that's terrible. If I can't articulate it into a policy that clearly benefits you, then I need to go back to the drawing board and understand how I can say, hey, this is how this benefits society as a whole, not just me. And a lot of the Christian principles in general are practical. And so I should be able to practically explain why human dignity and inalienable rights are important for everybody and not just people who are religious. And so there are always moral arguments to some extent. So I wouldn't say that they're not moral arguments, but are they moral arguments that can be articulated in a way that people who aren't religious can understand and appreciate? And I think we could do more to get there.
The website 538 recently found that African American Democrats support abortion about 20 points less than white Democrats, and the differences are more dramatic for assisted suicide and youth in Asia. Can you say something about why a party that ostensibly wants to hear voices of color seems to ignore their particular views on life issues?
Yeah, I think they ignore it because they can. And so I put the onus on, sometimes some of us to say, you allow them to ignore it. You allow them to say, well, our money comes from here, our votes come from here. If our votes aren't paying attention to where our money is forcing us to go, then why would we change? Why would we go away from where the money is and some of that income and just where we are ideologically? And so until more people stand up and say, I'm not going to allow you to get away with this, no matter how bad Trump is doing right now, no matter how bad I think conservatives are, there are some issues that are a matter of principle, and I'm not just going to go along to get along on those issues. And so, yeah, they'll do it as long as they can get away with it. But hopefully we can get more people involved and get exposure to what we're doing here to get more people to push back. And if you push back, it's a political calculation. It's simple. You make a political calculation that to support abortion and go past the safe, legal, and rare made political sense because there wasn't enough pushback to not to do it. And so they go with it. It's usually just a political calculation at the end of the day.